The sun is too bright. That is the first thing Nefertari notices. The sun does not feel like it should feel. It feels like something is burning her from the outside while something else is breaking her from the inside. She's 9 years old. Her father told her this morning that she was going to meet the gods. She believed him then. She does not believe him now. The patio of the Temple of Amun at Karnak is enormous. The stones beneath her feet are so hot that even through her sandals she can feel them. In front of her stands a priestess. The woman is old. She must be older than anyone Nefertari has ever seen, and her face is painted white like a skull. Black lines drawn around her eyes make her look like she's not entirely present, like part of her is looking at Nefertari from somewhere else, somewhere beyond the world. Behind her are other priests, men mostly, their heads shaved smooth. They stand completely still. They do not blink, they do not move, they just watch. The priestess steps forward. She's holding something. It takes Nefertari a moment to understand what it is. A razor. Bronze, reflecting the sun, a blade that looks like it could cut through stone. "You are Nefertari," the woman says. Her voice sounds like it is coming from the bottom of a well. That name means beautiful companion, but you will not carry that name anymore. Today you die, not your body, your identity. You're becoming something else, something that belongs to Amun, something that is no longer yours. Nefertari tries to speak, but her mouth is dry. She's been given nothing to drink since before dawn. She's been bathed. Her hair has been braided with flowers that smell like death. She's wearing a white linen dress that is too thin. She can feel the air on her skin through it. She can feel the eyes of the priests on her skin. "Hold her," the priestess says. Two servants grab Nefertari's arms. Their hands are rough. Their grip is tight. She tries to pull away and they grip tighter. They are so much stronger than she is. She is nothing. She understands this immediately. She has no strength here. She has no power. The priestess steps closer. She is so close that Nefertari can smell her. Old incense. Something rotting. Something that smells like the inside of a tomb. The priestess raises the razor. "The first cutting removes you from the world of men," the priestess says. She reaches out and takes a piece of Nefertari's hair. She cuts it. Just one strand. It falls to the ground. It looks like it falls slowly, even though Nefertari knows it should fall fast. Everything is moving slowly now. Everything is happening in a dream. This cannot be real. This cannot be happening. "The second cutting removes you from your family," the priestess continues. She cuts again. More hair. A handful now. It falls like dark rain onto the stones. "The third cutting removes you from yourself." The priestess takes her shears and brings them to Nefertari's head. She begins to cut. Fast. Methodical. Completely without emotion. Strand after strand. Nefertari's hair is falling around her. It lands on her shoulders. It lands on the hot stones. It lands on her sandals. And then Nefertari starts to cry. This is a mistake. She understands it immediately when the priestess's face changes, when the priestess lowers the shears and looks directly at Nefertari's eyes. The priestess's expression does not change, but something happens in the air. It becomes heavier. It becomes dangerous. "Servants of Amun do not cry," the priestess says quietly. She raises her hand. The blow comes so fast that Nefertari does not even register it before she feels the pain. The priestess has hit her across the face with the flat of her hand. The impact echoes across the patio. Other priests do not react. They simply continue watching, completely still, completely emotionless. "You will not cry," the priestess says. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not resist. You will not show weakness. You're no longer human in the way that other humans are human. You're an offering. You are property. You are a tool. And tools do not have the luxury of tears." She raises the shears again. She continues cutting. Nefertari's entire scalp is on fire. The blade is pulling at her hair. Blood is running down her neck. She does not know why there is blood. The priestess must have cut her skin. The priestess continues anyway. Cut after cut after cut. Nefertari's hair is completely gone now. She's bald. She looks down and sees her own hair scattered across the patio, like the ruins of something that used to be her. The priestess produces a cloth. She wipes the blade. She wipes it carefully. She is removing Nefertari's blood from the bronze. "You're acceptable," the priestess says, examining Nefertari's now bare scalp. Your skull shape is good. Your skin is smooth. You will do. The gods will be pleased. She nods to the servants. They release Nefertari's arms, but they do not step back. They stand there, watching, making sure she does not move. You will be taken to the inner chambers now, the priestess continues. There you will be dressed. There you will be trained. You will learn the ceremonies. You will learn the prayers. You will learn the exact movements that are required. You will learn to be useful. If you do any of these things correctly, you will be tolerated. If you do any of them incorrectly, you will be punished. The punishments will be creative. The punishments will be severe. The punishments will ensure that you never make the same mistake twice. Do you understand? Nefertari does not answer. She's staring at her hair on the ground. The priestess hits her again. Not as hard as before, but hard enough. Do you understand? Yes, Nefertari whispers. Yes, what? Yes, I understand. You will address me as Holy Mother. You will address all priests as Sacred One. You will address all priestesses as Holy Mother. Do you understand? Yes, Holy Mother. Good. You are learning. Perhaps you will not need to be broken as thoroughly as some of them. She gestures to the servants. They step forward and take Nefertari's arms again. They lead her away from the patio back toward the interior of the temple. As they walk, Nefertari catches a glimpse of the outside world, the sky, the distant sound of the river, the normal world continuing outside the temple walls. She will never see it again. She does not know this yet, but her body knows it. Her body can feel it. The doors of the temple close behind her with a sound like stone grinding against stone. The darkness inside is so complete that for a moment she cannot see. She has to let her eyes adjust. When they do, she sees only more stone, more shadows, more silence. That was her first day. The temple will consume the next 57 years of her life. Years that will dissolve into each other like water into sand. Years that will pass in such a blur of ceremony and protocol and carefully controlled movement that sometimes she will not remember what year it is. Years in which she will become someone else entirely, and then someone else again, until she'll look back and barely recognize the girl she used to be. If you enjoy exploring the darkest chapters of history, if you believe that understanding systems of exploitation is crucial to recognizing them in the present day, if you think that the people who suffered most deserve to be remembered despite the systems designed to erase them, leave a like right now and subscribe to this channel. Comment below where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever walked through these temples without knowing what they really were. Tell me if you see echoes of these patterns in the modern world. Tell me what you think. Because these stories need to travel. They need to be heard in every corner of the world. We investigate the darkest chapters of ancient history with brutal honesty. We do not look away. We do not romanticize. We tell you what actually happened behind the beautiful walls and the elegant ceremonies and the refined language. We give voice to people the empire tried to erase, and we make sure that their suffering is not forgotten. Most people who encounter the term temple virgins in ancient Egypt imagine something romantic. They picture elegant women in white linen performing beautiful rituals, honored servants of the gods living lives of spiritual devotion and religious importance. They imagine Vestal virgins of Rome, but with an Egyptian aesthetic. Sacred women respected and protected, choosing religious service as a noble calling. This romanticized image is completely wrong, and it is wrong in ways that reveal how effectively ancient propaganda worked, how completely the people who designed this system succeeded in hiding what they were really doing, behind beautiful language and sacred imagery. Think about what you just witnessed in Nefertari's first hours. That was not poetry. That was not romance. That was systematic dehumanization. The priestess with the skull-white face was not being cruel in isolation. She was executing a protocol that had been refined over thousands of years. The servants holding Nefertari while her hair was cut, they were not innovating. They were following procedure. The careful detail about what each cut meant, the first removing her from the world of men, the second from her family, the third from herself, these were not quaint rituals. They were mechanisms of control designed to crush individual identity and replace it with a function. They were destroying the girl and rebuilding her as a tool. The temple virgin system was not a spiritual practice. It was a machine designed with calculated precision to extract reproductive labor from girls and women, to create a hierarchy of sexual access that benefited only the priesthood and the gods they claimed to serve, to erase individual identity beneath layers of protocol and ceremony, and to ensure that a woman's entire purpose could be summarized in a single phrase: to bear children for the gods. What made the system particularly effective was this: it looked elegant from the outside. The temples were magnificent. The ceremonies were complex and beautiful. The language was refined and poetic. The art was extraordinary. The gardens were designed by masters. But none of this changed what was happening in the receiving chambers. None of this changed what happened in the inner sanctums. None of this changed that children were being trafficked into sexual servitude. None of this changed that women's bodies were property of the gods, available to be used or abandoned at the whim of priests claiming to speak for divinity. The beauty of the temple was not incidental to the system. It was essential to it. The beauty made the cruelty invisible. The elegance made the exploitation acceptable. The refinement made the horror seem like tradition. Let me explain the mechanism. This was not an unfortunate excess or a regrettable practice that happened at the margins of Egyptian society. This was central to how the temple system functioned. This was literally written into religious law. The position of temple virgin was codified in the administrative structure of the priesthood. There were elaborate hierarchies. Certain girls became concubines of Amun. Others served other gods. Within each category there were ranks. A first virgin might bear a child to the god and gain status through that. Others would never bear children and would spend their entire lives performing labour and rituals. Below even that were girls whose status was not officially recorded at all, girls who occupied a legal grey zone where virtually anything could happen to them. The system was designed to be efficient. It operated under a religious ideology that had become the dominant framework for understanding social order in Egypt. This ideology placed women in a rigid hierarchy. A woman's purpose was defined by her relationship to men gods, daughter to father, wife to husband, mother to sons, and if she was unlucky, concubine to a god through the priests who claimed to represent that god. A temple virgin fit into this framework perfectly. She was a woman whose primary duty was to produce children for the god, bearing sons who would strengthen the temple's authority, and daughters who would continue the system. But unlike a wife, a temple virgin had virtually no legal protections and no legitimate claim to the attention or resources of the man or institution that used her. She was property that could prey. In the temples of Amun, Osiris and Ra, the priestly class maintained what was essentially a state-sponsored system of reproductive servitude. The temples were the wealthiest institutions in Egypt. They owned vast amounts of land. They controlled resources. They collected taxes. They wielded power that rivaled that of pharaohs. To maintain that power, they needed to produce legitimacy. They needed to demonstrate that the gods favoured them, and to demonstrate the gods' favour, they needed to produce divine children. Temple virgins existed to serve this purpose. They were the mechanism through which priests could claim that gods walk the earth through their children. The administration of the temples required thousands of people. There were priests who performed the rituals. There were priestesses who managed the virgins. There were eunuchs who guarded the chambers. There were record keepers who tracked which virgin was fertile when, who had borne children, who had been useful, and who had not. The temple virgin system was not a harem in the romantic sense. It was a factory that consumed human beings and produced legitimacy for priestly authority and divine favour. Girls entered this system through multiple pathways. Some came from aristocratic families trying to maintain political alliances by offering daughters to the temples. By placing a daughter in the temple, a family hoped to gain favour with the priesthood, protection, or advantage in political matters. This was strategic. This was calculated. For the girl involved, it meant a life in captivity regardless of whether her family benefited. Some came from families of officials seeking to curry favour with the priests. A governor or scribe might send a beautiful daughter to the temple, hoping that if she caught the eye of the high priest or bore a son that could be presented as a divine child, his family's position would be elevated. Some came through active recruitment. Temple officials travelled through villages specifically to acquire young women and girls for the temples. They did not ask for volunteers. They selected girls based on appearance and presented families with an offer framed as an honour, but functioning as a commandment. A family could not refuse without risking loss of land, position, or worse. Some came as tribute from conquered territories. During military campaigns, captured women and girls were regularly allocated to temples as part of the spoils of war. Their status as captives created a double erasure. They had lost their homes, their families, and their names. They became generic property, useful only for reproduction and ritual labour. But the horror was not in the variety of pathways. The horror was that once inside the temple, all girls faced essentially the same fate. The daily life of a temple virgin was structured with obsessive precision. She woke before dawn. Servants dressed her in specific garments appropriate to her rank and the ceremonies of the day. Every aspect of her appearance was controlled. Her hair was arranged in prescribed styles. Her face was painted according to protocol. She wore jewellery in exact quantities. Her body was perfumed with specific oils. All of this took hours. A virgin could spend 5 or 6 hours preparing her body simply for the purpose of being seen by priests or in ceremonies. She learned in those hours that her body was not hers. It was a surface to be edited according to specifications set by others. It was a display case. It was an advertisement for the power of the gods, as represented by the priests. After preparation came ritual. Temple virgins moved through the temple in strict order, determined by rank and function. They performed ceremonies that had been refined over centuries, sometimes millennia. Every gesture had meaning. Every movement had been prescribed. Every word they spoke had been written down and memorized. They made offerings of incense in prescribed ways. They poured libations at prescribed angles. They sang hymns in prescribed rhythms. They bowed at prescribed depths. Every single moment of the day was occupied by ritual and protocol. A virgin quickly learned that maintaining any sense of individual identity, asserting preferences, expressing opinions, or even having thoughts that contradicted the official narratives was dangerous. Punishment was administered swiftly and often mysteriously. A virgin who dared to question the priests or show disrespect could be confined to dark chambers with minimal food. Some virgins were reported to have been left in such chambers for weeks. Others were beaten. The violence was not random. It was calibrated to instill a specific kind of fear, the fear of consequences so severe and so unpredictable that absolute compliance became the only rational choice. The real machinery of the system operated in the inner sanctum. This is where the language becomes inadequate. This is where the elegant protocols of religious hierarchy crashed into the reality of power and sex and access to bodies that could not refuse. In the temple system, a virgin's status fundamentally meant that she lived in a state of potential sexual availability. Priests could summon any virgin at any time. When summons came, and they came unpredictably, a virgin was brought to the sacred chambers. The encounter was framed in the most refined language. She was being blessed by the god. She was being chosen for divine favour. She was bearing the god's seed. These words, these rituals functioned as camouflage. They made something look acceptable that was actually the exercise of absolute power over a person who had no legitimate means of refusal. There were virgins who were summoned frequently. There were virgins who were summoned once and never again. There were virgins who were never summoned at all, who lived in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for a summons that would never come, knowing their entire purpose had failed. Virgins who became pregnant were locked away in special chambers. The pregnancy itself became property of the temple. The moment the child was born, it was removed. If the child was a son, he was taken to be raised by the temple priests, presented as a divine child, sometimes elevated to positions of authority within the priesthood itself. Depending on the virgin's rank, she might be allowed to see the child on rare ceremonial occasions, but she would have no role in its upbringing. The tie between mother and child was deliberately severed by protocol. This was intentional. The religious narrative required that the god, not the virgin, be the true parent. A virgin's biological maternity had to be erased for the religious fiction to hold. If the child was a daughter, the trauma of removal was compounded by the knowledge that the child would likely enter the same system. Some daughters of temple virgins became virgins themselves, perpetuating the cycle across generations. The psychological impact of bearing a child only to have it removed within hours or days, of watching your daughter grow into someone whose sole future purpose is to repeat your own captivity. This was not recorded in any official text, but it happened. It happened thousands upon thousands of times. It happened so many times that there were entire protocols for managing the emotional devastation. Virgins who tried to resist removal of their children were beaten. Virgins who expressed grief were told they were dishonoring the god. Virgins who refused to cooperate were sometimes poisoned or simply allowed to die from untreated wounds or illnesses. Physical control of virgins extended beyond protocol into literal architecture. The temple complexes were designed specifically to make escape impossible. Inner chambers were surrounded by outer chambers. Doors could be locked from the outside. Windows looked only onto internal courtyards. Some virgins spent decades without seeing the outside world, without feeling natural sunlight, without having a single conversation that was not circumscribed by temple protocol and priestly authority. There were stories, never confirmed but whispered among the virgins themselves, of girls who tried to escape. Some made it as far as the temple gates before being caught. What happened to them after? Capture was unclear, but the rumours served the purpose of control. The fear of what would happen if you tried to escape was often more effective than actual punishment. It kept virgins compliant not through constant violence, but through the constant threat of violence. The system produced a particular kind of psychological damage. A girl entered the temple as Nefertari or Takayat or whatever her name had been. Within weeks, she would be given a new name chosen by the high priestess. This was not a kindness. This was an erasure. New names were often religious: the beloved of Amun, the hand of Sekhmet, the whisper of Thoth. These names functioned as categories rather than identities. They stripped away individual identity and replaced it with function. A virgin quickly learned that maintaining any sense of self, expressing individual preferences, or even thinking thoughts that were not approved by the priests was dangerous. The official ideology taught that a virgin had been chosen by the gods, that she should feel honoured, that her suffering was proof of her divine favour. Virgins who believed this ideology were easier to control. Virgins who rejected it were punished until they either accepted it or died. The temple virgin system operated unquestioned for nearly 3,000 years. Multiple dynasties perpetuated it. Multiple pharaohs sanctioned it. The priesthood refined it and expanded it. It was so thoroughly embedded in the religious and legal structure of Egypt that virtually no one questioned whether it should exist. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about systems of profound exploitation. They become normal. They become expected. They become the foundation upon which society is built. Changing them would require questioning the fundamental religious narratives. So instead, they persist, generation after generation, consuming generations of girls and women without ever being seriously challenged from within. The system was never abolished through moral revolution. It simply faded as the temple system itself declined, and as external forces weakened the priesthood's authority. Today, the temples of Egypt are tourist attractions. Visitors walk the same corridors where virgins once walked in ceremonies. They photograph the hieroglyphics that celebrate the god's power. They marvel at the architecture and the artistry. Guides sometimes mention the temple virgins in passing, usually with language that makes the system sound quaint or mysterious. But they do not tell visitors that these temples were sites of systematic sexual exploitation of children. They do not explain that the beautiful reliefs celebrating the god's favour were propaganda designed to legitimate abuse. They do not talk about the thousands of girls whose names were erased and whose bodies were used and who were then disposed of when they were no longer useful. When you walk through those temples now, you can choose to remember that every corridor, every chamber, every seemingly empty room held human suffering. You can choose to remember that the beautiful hieroglyphics mask horrible realities. You can choose to remember Nefertari and the thousands of women whose names we will never know because the system they lived in was designed to make them invisible. You can choose to see them, even though the system they lived in was designed to ensure they would be forgotten. That act of remembering is a kind of justice. It is not the justice that would have freed them, that time is gone, but it is the justice of refusing to accept the official narrative that erased them. It is the justice of saying, your lives mattered, your suffering was real, you deserved better, and we will remember. If you believe history should be told in its entirety, that uncomfortable truths matter more than comfortable myths, subscribe to this channel, share this story, leave a comment about what you think about systems that hide exploitation behind beautiful language and sacred authority. Tell me if you've ever visited these temples and whether you knew about the temple virgin system. Tell me if you see echoes of these patterns in the modern world. Tell me where you're watching from. because these stories need to travel, they need to be heard. Not to wallow in darkness, but to understand how power hides itself, how systems of exploitation maintain themselves through propaganda and language, how the people who most need to be remembered are often the ones who are most thoroughly erased. The temples are still standing. The stones still remember. And now, so do you. The recruitment process for temple virgins was as carefully designed as the system that followed. Priests would travel through provinces, sometimes disguised as merchants or officials. They would observe girls in villages and towns. They looked for specific qualities. Beauty, certainly, but also vulnerability. Girls from poor families were preferred because their families were less likely to have connections powerful enough to challenge the temple. Girls whose fathers had died or whose mothers were weak were targeted. Girls who were isolated were selected. These were not accidental choices. This was predatory targeting. Priests understood what they were looking for. They understood which families would resist and which would comply. They understood which girls could be broken and which might prove difficult. When priests arrived at a family's home with a summons for a daughter, they framed it with elaborate courtesy. The family would be told their daughter had been noticed by the temple. She had been chosen for a great honor. She would be blessed and would bear divine children. The language made it sound like an elevation, an opportunity, a gift. What it actually meant was that the temple had decided to take the girl. What it actually meant was that the family's consent was being requested as a courtesy, not as a genuine choice. Families who refused faced subtle but unmistakable threats. Their land would be targeted by temple tax collectors. Their sons would find it difficult to advance in any position that required priestly approval. If a family was truly stubborn, more direct consequences would follow. Temple records speak obliquely of unfortunate accidents that befell families who resisted too strenuously. Drowned sons, daughters who became ill and died despite the best physicians. It was not always about murder. Sometimes it was about making life so difficult that families eventually relented. Resistance typically crumbled within a few months. Some girls were sold directly. Families in debt to the temple could settle their obligations by offering a daughter. This was codified in temple law. There was even a standard rate. A girl could settle a debt valued at a certain amount of grain or silver. This was human trafficking dressed up as debt settlement and made legal through religious authority. Some girls came from families so poor that they literally could not feed another mouth. These families did not make a difficult choice. They made an impossible one. Feed 4 children adequately or give 1 daughter to the temple so that 5 could survive on less. Under such circumstances, some girls were essentially abandoned at the temple gates. Priests would find them there, left as offerings, left as solutions to family desperation. Once inside the temple, a virgin underwent what can only be described as systematic psychological destruction, followed by carefully controlled psychological rebuilding. The initial phase, which lasted anywhere from weeks to months, was focused on breaking down resistance. This involved isolation, sleep deprivation, forced fasting, and ritual humiliation. New virgins were confined to small chambers. They were not allowed to see other virgins. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to eat normally. They were given just enough food to keep them alive, but not enough to maintain strength. They were awakened at irregular intervals. This destroyed their ability to maintain psychological equilibrium. It made them confused. It made them desperate for anything that resembled kindness or normalcy. Priests would observe this process. When a virgin reached a state of sufficient psychological breakdown, the second phase began. In the second phase, carefully selected teachers would begin the process of rebuilding the virgin's psychology around the temple system. These teachers were often older virgins or women who had been virgins and had graduated to positions of authority within the priesthood. They would offer comfort. They would provide food. They would explain the ideology of the system. They would tell the new virgins that their suffering was necessary, that it was a purification, that it was proof of the God's love. They would explain that to resist was to reject divine favor. They would explain that acceptance would bring peace. Many virgins who underwent this process genuinely came to believe the ideology they were being taught. The human mind is capable of remarkable rationalization. Given sufficient trauma and subsequent periods of care, people can come to believe almost anything. This is actually a well-documented psychological phenomenon. The destruction followed by carefully controlled rebuilding creates a kind of psychological dependence. The virgin becomes dependent on the system that is oppressing her, because the system is also the source of comfort and meaning in her life. Some virgins never fully accepted the ideology. They complied outwardly while maintaining inner resistance. These women would whisper to each other in darkness. They would pass information through seemingly innocent conversations. They would resist in small ways, a slight mistake in a ritual, a pause just a fraction too long in a ceremony, a look that suggested something other than absolute devotion. These small acts of resistance were dangerous. If discovered, they could result in severe punishment. But resistance persisted. Even in the most oppressive systems, human beings find ways to assert that they still exist, that they still have agency, that they have not been completely erased. There was a virgin named Takayat who had been in the temple for 20 years. She had borne 3 children, all of whom had been taken from her immediately. She had been beaten multiple times for minor infractions. She had been confined to dark chambers as punishment. By all external measures, she had been completely broken by the system. But Takayat maintained an act of resistance that seemed almost invisible to her captors. She had memorized the names and birth dates of all the children born to virgins during her time in the temple. She whispered these names every night, passing them to other virgins, creating a chain of memory that could not be erased by official records or priestly authority. When one virgin would leave the temple, through death, or rarely through release, Takayat would ensure that the new virgin learned these names. She was creating a counter-history. She was maintaining a record of the people the temple wanted to erase. This was not heroic in the grand sense. It was subtle, it was quiet, but it was resistance. It was the assertion that these lives had mattered, even if no official record acknowledged their existence. The sexual exploitation at the heart of the system was never openly discussed in temple records. It was hidden behind language about divine favour and bearing the gods' children. But we know it happened because the system required it. We know it happened because virgins bore children. We know it happened because virgins who refused sexual contact with priests were punished. The language of the temple obscured the reality, but the reality was that young girls and women were being sexually used by priests who claimed to act on behalf of gods. The priests themselves believed, or claimed to believe, that they were intermediaries for divine will. This belief, or claim of belief, allowed them to commit acts that would otherwise require them to acknowledge their own cruelty. Instead, they could tell themselves they were serving the gods. They could tell themselves the virgins should be grateful. They could tell themselves this was how the world worked and how it had always worked. The final stage of a virgin's life in the temple was often the most grim. As virgins aged, they became less useful. If a virgin had borne sons, she might retain some status and protection. If she had borne only daughters, or if she had never borne children, her value to the system declined rapidly. Some aged virgins were released from the temple, sent back out into the world with no preparation for survival and no connections to anyone who might help them. Some were transferred to other temples or assigned to service roles within the priesthood. Some simply died in the temple, often from illnesses that were treated only minimally because their lives no longer had value. The temple's records do not mention what happened to them. There are no death notices. There are no burials recorded. It is as if they simply ceased to exist. In a way they did. The temple had already erased them from the world of the living through its system of control. Physical death was simply the final step. The temple records that survive show an extraordinary obsession with tracking information about virgins. Priests maintained detailed lists. They recorded which virgin was fertile when. They tracked pregnancies. They documented births. They noted which virgins had been difficult and required special handling. These records were not kept for the welfare of the virgins. They were kept for administrative purposes. A virgin was an asset. Assets need to be managed. These surviving records, preserved in temples and museums, provide some of the only evidence we have about the reality of the system. The priests who created these records did not see anything wrong with what they were documenting. They were simply recording standard administrative procedures. The fact that these procedures involved the systematic exploitation of children did not strike them as noteworthy. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire system, how completely normalized it had become, how thoroughly it had been integrated into the official functioning of religious institutions. How many people participated in it without ever apparently questioning whether it was right? The temples still stand today. Their walls still carry the hieroglyphics that celebrate the god's power and the pharaoh's authority. The carvings still depict beautiful women making offerings to gods. The artwork is still stunning. The architecture is still extraordinary. Millions of people visit these temples every year and marvel at them. They read the hieroglyphics. They learn about the religious practices. They understand something of Egyptian civilization. But what they do not learn, what most guides do not tell them, what most histories do not include, is the reality of the temple virgin system. They do not learn about the thousands of girls who entered these temples and never left. They do not learn about the children born to virgins and immediately separated from them. They do not learn about the systematic sexual exploitation hidden behind religious language. The temples were sites of profound human suffering, but that suffering has been almost completely erased from the historical record. It has been forgotten in favour of narratives about divine favour and architectural grandeur and the eternal glory of ancient Egypt. But the forgetting is not complete. There are fragments. There are gaps in the official records that suggest what happened. There are temple records that inadvertently reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation. There are occasional references in texts written by later observers who seemed genuinely troubled by what they were describing. And there are the silences themselves, the absolute absence of any voice from the virgins themselves, which is itself evidence of a deliberate erasure. If the system had been as benign as the official narrative suggested, the virgins' own accounts would have survived. That they did not. That no virgin's own testimony about her experience exists in any surviving Egyptian text is itself suggestive of systematic suppression. The legacy of the temple virgin system persists in ways that are difficult to recognize but important to acknowledge. The ideology that supported the system, the idea that some people exist primarily to serve others, that certain bodies are public resources rather than private property, that hierarchy is natural and inevitable, did not die with ancient Egypt. It has mutated and taken new forms. It appears in systems of exploitation that continue into the present day. Every system that uses people as resources, that treats certain populations as existing for the benefit of others, that systematizes the sexual or reproductive exploitation of vulnerable populations, traces a line back to systems like the temple virgin structure. Understanding the ancient system is not merely historical curiosity. It is crucial to recognizing similar systems when they appear in modern contexts. The priests who ran the temple system believed they were doing something sacred. They believed they were serving the gods. They believed they were maintaining cosmic order. None of these beliefs made what they were doing any less exploitative or harmful. This is an important lesson. Good intentions do not justify exploitation. Sacred language does not legitimize abuse. Religious authority does not give anyone the right to use human beings as property. When we study the temple virgin system, we're not studying some aberration of an otherwise just society. We're studying how a normal, functioning society can institutionalize profound cruelty through the simple act of wrapping it in religious and cultural authority. When Nefertari was 50, she had been in the temple for 47 years. She had borne only one child, a daughter who had also become a temple virgin. She had never been selected for special favor. She had never been elevated to a position of authority within the priesthood. She had simply served, day after day, year after year, performing the same ceremonies, speaking the same prayers, bowing at the same angles. Her body had aged. The beauty that had made her valuable to the system had faded. She had become invisible. And in her invisibility, she had found something close to peace. She was no longer summoned to the inner chambers. She was no longer valued for her reproductive capacity. She was simply allowed to exist. It was not freedom. It was not even a good life. But it was a kind of rest from the worst of the system's demands. She died in the temple, unremarked and unrecorded. No temple document noted her passing. No prayer was offered for her soul. Her body was disposed of in a manner that left no trace. She had entered the system as a person and had been systematically erased. By the time of her death, she no longer existed in any official capacity. She had been completely consumed by the machine she had been fed into at age 9. This is the reality that the beautiful temples obscure. This is what the hieroglyphics do not tell us. This is the story that has been hidden for 3,000 years beneath layers of religious language and cultural reverence for ancient Egyptian achievement. But we can choose to remember differently. We can choose to look at those temples and see not just the beauty but the suffering that lies beneath it. We can choose to acknowledge that every architectural achievement, every artistic marvel, every religious innovation in those temples was built on the foundation of thousands of destroyed lives. We can choose to refuse the comfortable narrative that these temples represent humanity's highest achievements. We can insist on a more complete history. We can demand that the voices of the victims be heard, even if we have to imagine those voices ourselves, because the official records silenced them. This is what remembering really means. Not just learning dates and facts and architectural details, but understanding the human cost, acknowledging the suffering, refusing to accept the erasure, saying, these people mattered, these lives had value, this suffering was real, and we will not forget. The temples of Egypt still draw millions of visitors each year. They remain among the most visited archaeological sites in the world. People stand before them and feel awe. They take photographs. They read about the pharaohs and the gods and the religious innovations of ancient Egypt. They learn about hieroglyphics and papyrus and the development of writing systems. They marvel at the precision of the construction. They admire the surviving artwork. It is beautiful. The temples genuinely are remarkable achievements. But alongside that beauty, we must now see the suffering. We must now acknowledge that the grandeur was built on the backs of thousands of exploited women and children. We must refuse to let the beauty distract us from the horror that occurred within those walls. This is not about diminishing respect for ancient Egyptian civilization. Egypt produced extraordinary achievements. But no civilization achieves greatness without human cost. The question is whether we acknowledge that cost or hide from it. The question is whether we see the complete picture or only the parts that make us comfortable. The Temple Virgin system shows us that even a great civilization can systematize profound cruelty. It shows us that religious authority can be weaponized to exploit the vulnerable. It shows us that the most effective oppression hides itself in beautiful language and sacred ritual. These are lessons that remain relevant today.